The desert wind doesn't just blow, it cuts. It peels the hope right out of your heart, leaving nothing but dust and silence. And out in the middle of that Nevada wasteland, a lonely widow named Margaret Sullivan was about to make a deal that would either save her life or get her killed. She was 35, but the desert had carved years into her face. Grief had put a permanent shadow in her eyes. For 3 years, ever since the fever took her husband, she'd been alone. The silence of her homestead was a living thing, broken only by the cry of coyotes. In town, they whispered. Poor Margaret, they'd say, childless and alone. Their pity was worse than their judgment. She'd tried hiring help, but no one ever stayed. This land was a graveyard of broken dreams, and hers was next. But then she saw a notice tacked to the saloon board. Experienced hand seeking work. No questions asked. The saloon keeper pointed to a young man sitting alone. That's him, he said. Keeps to himself. But be careful, Margaret. The man looked up, and his eyes were bluer than a desert sky. I need help, she said, her voice plain. Hard work. Fair pay. $50 for the season. It was almost everything she had left. A fortune she couldn't afford. The young man just nodded. When do I start, ma'am? Name's William Thornton. Folks call me Will. And just like that, the deal was done. She had no idea she'd just invited a storm to her doorstep, a storm of secrets, violence, and a past that was hunting him down. The next morning, a lone rider appeared out of the dust. He was younger than she thought, maybe 25, but he moved with the quiet grace of a man who'd seen too much. I'll tell you plain, she said, her arms crossed tight. This isn't easy work. The land fights you every step. Will gave a ghost of a smile. Comfort and I parted ways long ago. I'm just looking for honest work. Something in his voice, steady and respectful, made her pause. She searched his face for a lie and found nothing. The days that followed were a blur of sweat and dust. Will worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, clearing ditches, never saying a word of complaint. He was different from other men. Quieter, kinder. Margaret watched him from her kitchen window. She watched the muscles in his back strain against the stubborn earth. She watched him speak gently to her horse, and she felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in 3 long years. Hope. But hope is a dangerous thing in the desert. That night a storm hit. The wind howled like a demon, battering the small house. Margaret heard a crash and ran to the porch, right into a wall of sand. A strong hand grabbed her arm. It was Will. The chickens, she gasped. Already secured them in the barn, he yelled over the wind. Saw the storm coming. They stood in the dim kitchen, the lamp flickering. The house groaned around them. The barn roof won't hold, she said. Then I'll stay here, he replied. By the stove, if that's acceptable. She nodded, her throat tight. As the storm raged, she lay in her bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from the other room. The sound filled the silence that had haunted her for so long, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that this man was changing everything. The morning after the storm, the world was quiet. Will was already outside, mending the roof. He moved with a steady purpose, as if the storm had been nothing more than another chore. When he came in for breakfast, he paused in the doorway. You didn't have to start so early, she said. Storm made work for us, he replied. The way he said us made her turn away, hiding the sudden mist in her eyes. For 3 years it had just been me. Days turned into weeks. They fell into a rhythm, hard work, shared meals, quiet evenings on the porch. He worked the land like it was his own. She found herself talking more, sharing stories of her past. He never pressed for details. He just listened. But the land had one more test for them. The well started failing. Every bucket brought up more silt than water. Her garden withered. James searched for years for another spring, she told him, the bitterness sharp in her voice. All he found was dust. Will stared out at the hills. Mining teaches a man to read the ground, he said. Water moves like veins. Sometimes it just hides. There was a certainty in his voice that was almost hypnotic. She handed him the reins to the mule. Go then, she said. If there's hope left in this land, bring it back. He returned at sundown, covered in grime, but his eyes were blazing. It's there, he said. Not much, but enough. For 3 days they dug side by side under the merciless sun. They hauled stones, shared the same cup of water, and held on to the same fragile hope. On the third day, water seeped into the hole, cold and clear. Margaret dropped to her knees, scooping it into her hands, the tears streaming down her face. It tasted like life itself. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Will, holding him tight. He stiffened for a second. Then his arms came around her, strong and sure. When they pulled apart, the air between them had changed. It was charged with something new, something dangerous. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of his arms around her was a fire in her blood. But the desert wasn't done with them yet. Trouble was coming, and it had a name: Samuel Henford. On her next trip to town, the whispers were sharper. $50 for a hired hand, one woman sneered, and more besides, if you ask me. Margaret ignored them. But outside the store, Samuel Henford blocked her path. He was a wealthy rancher, twice her age, with a mean streak fueled by whiskey. "Widow Sullivan," he drawled, his eyes crawling over her. "Heard you got yourself a young man out there. Must get mighty lonely." "Good day, Mr. Henford," she said, trying to move past him. "Maybe I ought to visit," he said, stepping closer. "See if he's treating you proper." Before he could touch her, a quiet voice cut through the air. "Mrs. Sullivan, everything all right?" Will was standing by the wagon. He looked calm, but his eyes were cold as steel. Henford's smirk faded. "Well, well, the hired hand." "My place is wherever Mrs. Sullivan needs me," Will said. "Right now, that's helping her load supplies." Henford laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Careful, boy. You're playing a dangerous game." He staggered off, but his threat hung in the air like poison. That night, the silence at the supper table was heavy. "He bothers you again, you tell me," Will said finally. "I can handle Samuel Henford," she replied, though her hands were trembling. "I know you can," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Doesn't mean you should have to." Her heart twisted. For years she had been alone. Now this man, this stranger, was offering to stand with her, and she realized she was terrified, not of Henford, but of how much she was starting to need the man she barely knew. The next day, riders appeared on the horizon. It was the sheriff, and with him were Henford and his men. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," the sheriff said, his face grim. "We've had complaints." "You mean lies," Margaret shot back, her voice shaking with anger. Henford smirked. "Folks are concerned is all. A widow, alone with a young drifter. It ain't right. He's done nothing but honest work." "Maybe so," the sheriff said, his eyes full of pity. "But it corrupts decent society. He has to go." "If this is about me, I'll leave," Will said, his voice flat. "No!" The word tore from Margaret's throat. The sheriff sighed. "I'm sorry, Margaret. If he's still here tomorrow, I'll have to take him in. The judge won't look kindly on it." They rode away, leaving Margaret frozen in the dust. "You should have let them take me," Will said quietly. "No," she whispered. "They had no right. Rights don't matter when men like Henford twist the law." His jaw was tight. "I'll pack my things." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't lose him. "You can't leave," she said, the words barely a breath. "Not now." She looked at him, and the truth she'd been hiding finally spilled out. "Not when I love you." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and terrifying. That night she found him by the barn, his saddlebags packed. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Doesn't matter," he said, not looking at her. "Somewhere my past can't follow." "Your past?" He hesitated, then the story came out in a torrent of low, pained words. His name wasn't Will Thornton. It was Daniel Morrison. He was a wanted man. "I left Texas 5 years ago," he said. "My father was a hard man. Drank. One night he raised a belt to my sister. I stopped him." He swallowed hard. "Stopped him for good." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "His brother was the sheriff," he continued. "Didn't matter, it was self-defense. They'd have hanged me, so I ran. Been running ever since." The truth should have scared her. It should have made her lock her door. But it didn't. All she could see was the boy he'd been, protecting his sister, the man he'd become, protecting her. "We're all running from something," she said softly. Maybe we don't have to run alone. Before he could answer, lanterns flared in the darkness. Hooves thundered into the yard. It was Henford and his men, drunk and looking for a fight. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," Henford slurred. "Thought we'd see how you and your killer are getting along." The word hung in the air. Killer. He knew. How could he know? "Leave," Margaret said, her voice like ice. "I don't think so," Henford sneered, dismounting. "Your hired man here has a price on his head back in Texas. Seems his uncle, the sheriff, is a very good friend of mine." The trap had been sprung. This was never about gossip. It was a manhunt, and Henford was there to collect the bounty. Will Daniel moved faster than she'd ever seen him move. He planted himself between her and Henford. "You heard her. Time to go." Henford just laughed. "I'm not going anywhere without him." The first punch was a blur. Chaos erupted. Men swarmed Will, dragging him down. Margaret ran inside, her mind screaming. She grabbed the rifle from over the fireplace. When she came back out, her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Get off my land," she ordered. Henford turned, his eyes full of drunken victory. "Look at that. The widow thinks she's a gunslinger. I said leave." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Henford laughed, an ugly, mean sound. "This ain't over." He mounted his horse. His men, bloodied but triumphant, dragged Will toward them, his hands now bound. "I'll be back for my money, Margaret," Henford called, "and for you." They rode off, swallowing Will into the darkness. Margaret was alone again. The silence that descended was worse than before. It was the silence of defeat. But as she stood on her porch, rifle in her hand, she felt something else rise up through the fear. Rage. They had taken her hope. They had taken her love. They had underestimated the wrong woman. Margaret didn't sleep. She spent the night pacing, the rifle her only companion. The fury inside her burned away the fear, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. They thought she was a helpless widow. They were about to find out how wrong they were. At first light, she saddled her horse. She rode not to the sheriff, but to the telegraph office. She sent a single cryptic message to a man in Texas. A man her late husband James had once told her about. A man who owed him a debt. "Daniel Morrison is in Nevada. Henford has him. The debt is due." She didn't know if the message would even be received. She didn't know if the debt would be honored. It was a wild shot in the dark, but it was the only shot she had. Then she rode to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Coleman looked up, his face a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "Margaret, I told you." "I'm not here to argue," she cut him off, her voice flat. "I'm here to post bail for Daniel Morrison." The sheriff's jaw dropped. "Bail? For a murder suspect? Margaret, that's impossible. And where would you get that kind of money?" She placed a leather pouch on his desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Inside were the $50 she was supposed to pay Will, and the 50 more she had scraped together by selling her mother's wedding ring. Everything she had left in the world. "That's not enough," the sheriff said gently. "It's a down payment," she replied. "The rest is secured by my land." She was betting her entire future on a man she'd known for a few weeks, a man who was a confessed killer. Coleman stared at her, then at the pouch, then back at her. He saw the iron in her eyes. He sighed, defeated. "I'll have to hold him until the Texas Ranger gets here to collect him. But he's your responsibility." When they brought Will out, his face was bruised, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Margaret, and the question in his gaze was plain. "Why?" "Because you didn't run," she said simply. They rode back to the homestead in silence. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. He was a free man for now, but they both knew they were living on borrowed time. Henford would not let this go, and the Texas Ranger was coming. They had 2 days. They spent them preparing. They boarded up the windows. They cleaned and loaded every weapon James had left behind. They worked together, their movements a seamless dance. They were no longer a widow and a hired hand. They were partners, soldiers preparing for the final battle. On the evening of the second day, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You should have let me go," he said quietly. "You've risked everything for me." "There was nothing left to risk," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon, "until you came." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm. steady. Margaret, he began, his voice rough with emotion, but he never finished. In the distance, a dust cloud appeared. Not one rider, at least a dozen. It was Henford. He was done with threats. He was done with the law. He was coming to burn them out. And this time, there would be no running. Get inside, Will. No, Daniel said, his voice low and urgent. He pushed her toward the door as the first shot rang out, splintering the porch rail beside her head. The homestead erupted into a war zone. Muzzle flashes lit up the twilight. Bullets chewed through the thin wooden walls of the house. Margaret and Daniel returned fire, moving from window to window, 2 people against an army. They fought with a desperate courage, fueled by the love they'd never had a chance to speak aloud. They were outnumbered, outgunned. It was hopeless. One of Henford's men managed to toss a lit torch onto the barn roof. The dry timber caught fire instantly, flames leaping into the night sky. "The barn!" Margaret cried. "Let it burn," Daniel said, pulling her away from the window just as a bullet shattered the glass. "We just have to hold out." Hold out for what? A miracle. As the barn blazed, casting an eerie orange glow over the battlefield, another sound joined the cacophony of gunfire. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the east. Margaret's heart leaped. The Texas Ranger? Had he come early? But as the riders burst into the clearing, she saw they weren't lawmen. There were at least 10 of them, hard-faced men with rifles ready. They were led by a man with a graying mustache and the coldest eyes she had ever seen. Henford let out a whoop of victory. "See, Morrison," he shouted, "your uncle is here to take you home." The sheriff from Texas, Daniel's uncle. He had come to take his nephew back to hang. It was over. The new arrivals reined in, their horses circling the burning homestead. Daniel's uncle, Sheriff Morrison, dismounted slowly. He looked at the chaos, at Henford's triumphant face, at the house riddled with bullet holes. "Henford," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl. "What in God's name is this?" "Just collecting your fugitive for you, Sheriff," Henford said with a smug grin. "He and this woman put up quite a fight." The sheriff's cold eyes swept over the scene, then landed on the porch, where Margaret and Daniel stood, cornered and defeated. Daniel met his uncle's gaze, his face grim. There was no pleading in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance of his fate. Sheriff Morrison walked forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He stopped a few feet from Henford. "I got a telegraph, Doromasimam," the sheriff said, "from a man named Clayton. Said a debt was due, said my nephew was in trouble." He looked past Henford, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "He also said a woman named Margaret Sullivan was betting her life on the fact that blood is thicker than lies." Henford's smile vanished. "I came here to collect a fugitive," Sheriff Morrison continued, his voice dropping even lower. "But it looks to me like all I found is a landowner defending his property from a drunken mob." He turned to his men. "Boys," he said, and there was no mistaking the command in his voice. "Arrest these men for attempted murder." Henford stared in disbelief as the Texas Rangers surrounded his men, disarming them with brutal efficiency. "Morrison, you can't," he sputtered. "We had a deal." "The deal's off," the sheriff said, grabbing Henford by the collar. "You lied to me. You said he was a danger. But the only danger I see here is you." As the Rangers dragged Henford and his men away, Sheriff Morrison walked up to the porch. He looked at his nephew, then at Margaret. The years of anger and resentment seemed to melt away, leaving only a deep, weary sadness. "He was my brother," the sheriff said, his voice cracking. "But he was a monster. I knew what he did to your sister, to your mother. I was just too much of a coward to stop him." He looked Daniel in the eye. "You did what I should have done years ago. You're no murderer, son. You're a hero." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather-bound Bible. "This was your mother's," he said, pressing it into Daniel's hands. "She would have been proud of you, of both of you." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am," he said, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You bet on the right man." With that, he turned and rode away, leaving them in the quiet aftermath of the battle. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering ruin. The house was scarred with bullet holes, but the well was still flowing, and they were still standing. Together, they rebuilt. The neighbors, hearing the story of the fight, of Henford's treachery, and the Texas Sheriff's Justice came to help. They raised a new barn, stronger than the last. They patched the walls of the house. They brought seeds for a new garden. The whispers in town changed. They no longer spoke of the poor, lonely widow. They spoke of the Sullivan Ranch, a place of courage and second chances. One evening, as they sat on the rebuilt porch, Daniel took Margaret's hand. "I've been running my whole life," he said. "I'm tired of running." He looked at her, his blue eyes full of a love that was as fierce and true as the desert itself. "Margaret Sullivan, will you marry a wanted man?" "No," she said softly, a smile touching her lips. "But I'll marry Daniel Morrison." They were married by the new spring, the water they had found together a symbol of their future. Their life was never easy. The desert was still a hard land, but it was their land, and they were no longer alone. They built a life from the ashes, a love forged in fire and faith. And they proved that even in the most desolate of places, hope, like a hidden spring, can be found if you just know where to look. What a journey. It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards. If you enjoyed this story of love and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe to the channel because we've got plenty more stories from the heart of the Wild West coming your way. Thanks for listening.